The art of the final departure within a completely unforgiving and fractured system. 3 in the morning. The objective is simple. Turn a permanent silencing into a voluntary exit. Precision is everything. A 1% miscalculation means your own light gets permanently turned off. Biological functions have ceased due to sudden kinetic impact. Now, the real architecture begins. Gravity is an obstacle. Physics dictates the perfect angle to sell this tragic illusion. Anchor the weight. Ensure the narrative holds up against the relentless scrutiny of the observers. The props must tell a story of despair. Every overturned object is a heavily calculated whisper. Erase the violent truth. Replace the crimson fluid with the overpowering stench of industrial bleach. Chaos cannot be random. It must be a carefully orchestrated symphony of fabricated mental collapse. Drop the temperature. Slow down the inevitable biological decay to buy the narrative more time. Trust nothing but the ultraviolet spectrum. The smallest microscopic oversight is a fatal death sentence. The final testament. A forged document built upon the most vulnerable corners of the human mind. You write their final despair. But the hollow words start echoing your own silent exhaustion. The fiction becomes too real. The lines blur violently between their forced exit and your reality. The psychological toll extracts its payment. A fractured mind, absorbing the poison of the underground trade. Lock the trauma away. The cartel architects do not accept emotional vulnerability as a valid excuse. The installation is complete, a masterpiece of tragic isolation ready for the morning shift patrol. Seal the chamber. The final mechanical click separates the architect from his grim, chilling canvas. Fade back into the shadows. The underworld demands absolute invisibility until the next inevitable call. Fire consumes the remnants. Another successful operation buried beneath the concrete arteries of the city. The adrenaline fades, leaving only the crushing weight of the shadow architecture you just built. The physical armor drops, but the psychological barriers are already fracturing under the immense pressure. Your body physically rejects the poison. The mind struggles to process the calculated deception. Wash away the invisible stains. The cold reality is that some marks are entirely permanent. Reboot the system. Emotional interference is a fatal flaw in the machinery of the underworld. The artist must observe the gallery. Surveillance ensures the forged narrative is consumed without question. Dawn approaches. The stage is perfectly set for the inevitable discovery by the morning shift. The initial audience arrives. Their predictable protocols make them the easiest variables to manipulate perfectly. Intercept the communications. The confirmation of the illusion will be broadcasted over the encrypted waves. Listen closely to the static. The mechanical voices will dictate the success of the operation. The moment of truth. Any structural inconsistency in the staging will be exposed. Right now, the bait is taken. They bought the tragic departure without a single microsecond of hesitation. The detectives arrive. They will find perfectly arranged chaos and nothing but a hollow shell. Leave no digital echoes. Total erasure is the only acceptable standard in this dark industry. The cycle never ends. The invisible architects already demand another surgical removal from the equation. New coordinates received. Another fractured soul requires a highly orchestrated transition into the absolute void. You acknowledge the order. Refusal is an immediate trigger for your own permanent structural failure. Restock the inventory. The mechanics of the dark underworld operate strictly on a continuous loop. Calibrate the contingencies. The next canvas will require absolute perfection to satisfy the demanding architects. You fade back into the machine. A necessary ghost maintaining the brutal equilibrium of power. The concrete maze swallows your vehicle. You become an anonymous ghost, delivering a highly orchestrated conclusion. Silence is the heaviest armor. The calm before the mechanical storm of another forced structural failure. Corrosion eats through steel, just as the relentless paranoia eats through the minds of the architects. Break the physical barriers. Penetrate the secured perimeter to deliver the inevitable one-way ticket. Map the thermal signatures. Identify the breathing target before initiating the complex neutralization sequence. Blind the digital eyes. The watchers must only see static when the real architecture begins. The system goes offline, a localized blackout to ensure the canvas remains completely undisturbed. Cross the final threshold. Enter the volatile environment where a new tragic illusion will be constructed. Paranoia accelerates the pulse. They always attempt to flee when the invisible clock runs out. The shadow catches up. There is no viable escape route from the cartel's internal cleanup mechanism. Initiate the chemical shutdown, a sudden physiological collapse to ensure the subject is securely taken offline. The structural foundation crumbles. Resistance is futile against a scientifically calculated dosage of absolute compliance. Greed becomes irrelevant. Paper currency cannot negotiate a pardon from the inevitable descent into silence. Confirm the suppressed vitals. The canvas is prepared for the meticulous staging of a voluntary exit. Reposition the dead weight. The architecture of despair requires the perfect environmental focal point to succeed. Calculate the deadly geometry. The mechanics of the illusion demand strict adherence to physical laws. The tools of the trade. Raw materials designed to construct a perfect narrative of terminal hopelessness. Secure the high ground. The foundation of the lie must be strong enough to hold heavy scrutiny. Test the structural integrity. The stage is built to support the crushing weight of the final act. The preparation concludes. Now, you must elevate the subject and permanently close their final chapter. Secure the physical framework. The illusion of a desperate final decision must be flawlessly executed. Defy gravity to construct the tragedy. Elevate the empty shell to finalize the chilling narrative. Friction and steel hold the weight. The structural integrity of the deception is absolutely uncompromising. Anchor the final sequence. Lock the volatile elements into a perfectly orchestrated display of despair. Paint the picture of a failed escape. Wealth becomes meaningless when the final door closes. Orchestrate the chaos. A clean environment contradicts the narrative of a deeply fractured, terrified mind. The remnants of greed, completely useless artifacts left behind in the wake of absolute silence. Plant the digital despair. An unsent plea for help solidifies the illusion of total isolation. Analyze the installation. The chilling geometry must perfectly reflect a complete collapse of human willpower. The darkness bleeds inward. Suppress the psychological static before it compromises your own structural integrity. Erase the phantom footsteps. The invisible architect leaves no physical trace of his calculated intervention. Dissolve the variables. Chemical erasure is the ultimate insurance policy against the relentless external observers. Pack away the instruments. The dark mechanics of the underworld demand immediate transition and mobility. Confirm the sterile environment. A 0-degree thermal signature ensures the canvas remains a perfect secret. Abandon the masterpiece. The artist must never linger within the cold gallery of their own creation. Do not look back. Emotional resonance with the static figures leads to immediate operational failure. Break the seal. Returning to the freezing reality of the fractured and violent urban maze. Disappear into the storm. The hostile environment provides the perfect camouflage for a shadow operative. Restore the digital eyes. Let the observers blindly record the aftermath of a flawless illusion. The ghost vanishes completely. The cartel's invisible architecture remains perfectly intact until the next call. The storm masks the mechanical hum of the engine, but it cannot drown out the internal static. The architects demand an immediate debrief. The shadow economy requires constant verification of a successful removal. Navigate the cold arteries. Every mapped turn is another descent into the unforgiving mechanical void. Enter the cold storage, a fitting environment for those who traffic in absolute permanent silence. The shot caller waits, the man who designs the tragic illusions from the safety of a clean room. They never touch the dirt, they only distribute the heavy burden of the permanent physical erasure. A silent confirmation. The hollow shell is securely suspended, and the digital footprint is entirely erased. The transaction is sterile. Compensation for successfully engineering another sudden collapse of human structural integrity. The cold payment. A heavy stack of currency designed to violently suppress the rising psychological toll. Trust is a fabricated concept. You only trust the heavy weight of the payment in your armor. The machine never stops. One tragic illusion ends, and the coordinates for the next immediately appear. You take the new assignment. Refusing the architecture is a direct invitation for your own permanent removal. The digital poison. The blueprints for the next inevitable descent into absolute, terrifying isolation. Retreat into the chaotic weather. The sanitized lies of the cartel are heavier than the violent rain. The armor comes off, exposing the heavily fractured psychological foundation underneath the cold, calculated exterior. The new target environment. A pristine gallery waiting for the installation of a meticulously forged tragedy. Calculate the spatial variables. Every corner is a potential stage for a carefully simulated collapse. The internal pressure breaches containment. The machinery of the mind struggles to process the relentless darkness. Force the reboot. Vulnerability is a fatal flaw that the observers will immediately exploit and neutralize. The engine roars into the void. The invisible architect drives toward the next inevitable tragic canvas. The violent maze shifts into a pristine gallery, a quiet neighborhood hiding a mathematically perfect structural collapse. Bypass the digital guardians. Luxury security systems are merely fragile illusions built to comfort the terrified elite. The digital wall crumbles silently. Another pristine sanctuary forcefully opened to the ruthless mechanics of the underworld. Step into the sterile canvas. The architecture of wealth cannot stop the inevitable, highly calculated descent. The subject is already offline. The primary removal is finished, leaving only the complex art of deception. Relocate the heavy remnants. The center of the gallery requires a mathematically perfect focal point for observers. The heavy tracks of the shadow architect. An invisible force permanently altering the pristine domestic landscape. Analyze the overhead structure. The illusion of a desperate final exit demands absolute structural integrity above all. Secure the high anchor. Gravity is the ultimate tool for selling a completely fabricated psychological collapse. Hoist the heavy silence. Elevate the narrative until it becomes an undeniable, tragic fact for the detectives. Lock the heavy variables into place. The final physical transition is now structurally perfect and completely undeniable. Fabricate the digital despair. A sudden loss of immense wealth provides the perfect logical catalyst for tragedy. The digital motive is securely planted. Observers always seek a comfortable, logical reason for a sudden exit. Orchestrate the necessary physical chaos. A perfectly sterile room contradicts the violent storm of a fractured mind. Scan the dark spectrum. The smallest microscopic oversight immediately triggers an aggressive, fatal response from the cartel. Dissolve the phantom presence. The invisible architect must never leave a single microscopic signature on the canvas. The trauma forcibly resurfaces. The human mind violently rejects the continuous production of such perfectly engineered despair. Shatter the emotional anchors. The architecture of the underworld demands the total destruction of all human connections. Lock down the emotional breach. You are a mechanical instrument of silence, devoid of any personal attachments. Fade into the suburban darkness. Another structural collapse perfectly executed, feeding the relentless hunger of the machine. The gallery is closed. Now, the heavy isolation of the safe house awaits the returning shadow. The physical armor comes off, but the intense psychological pressure continues to forcefully crush your lungs. The continuous dripping mimics the relentless, heavy countdown of your own violently fractured sanity. The mechanical foundation violently cracks. The engineered despair of the empty shells begins echoing inside you. The ghosts refuse to stay in the shadows. They permanently anchor themselves to your broken mind. You read the fabricated tragedy again. The words you wrote perfectly reflect your own hopeless reality. The lie becomes the absolute truth. You authored the exact blueprint of your own eventual collapse. A confession masquerading as a forgery. The invisible architect unknowingly drafting his own final chapter. Compartmentalize the heavy trauma. The underworld instantly neutralizes any operative displaying structural emotional weakness. Morning arrives. The final phase requires absolute confirmation of the perfectly orchestrated physical departure. Connect to the digital eyes. The watchers must verify the flawless execution of the tragedy. The initial audience takes the stage. Their predictable responses validate the terrifying perfection of the illusion. Intercept the frantic frequencies. The mechanical voices will legally certify the permanent structural failure. The frequency violently confirms the success. The target is officially registered as a voluntary exit. The physical barrier is breached. They step directly into the perfectly sanitized gallery of despair. The bait is swallowed completely. The complex architecture of the illusion remains utterly unquestioned. The adrenaline aggressively fades. A highly toxic satisfaction temporarily masks the crushing weight of the isolation. The ultimate test arrives. The analysts will meticulously dissect the heavy shadows you left behind. Scrutinize the dark canvas. The masterpiece is structurally flawless, down to the smallest chaotic variable. Close the digital windows. The invisible architect successfully vanishes back into the chaotic urban static. The analyst accepts the forged despair. the heavy illusion officially becomes an undeniable tragic fact. Cut the visual feed. The performance is completely over, but the psychological echoes refuse to silence. The screen goes dark, a perfectly empty reflection waiting for the next violently staged tragedy. The temporary relief violently fades. The crushing machinery of the underworld never allows for genuine rest. March back into the freezing void. Every heavy step brings you closer to your own departure. The inventory violently demands a restock. The cycle of forced exits requires a perfectly maintained arsenal. Chamber the heavy reality. Survival strictly depends on immediate, aggressive compliance to the invisible architects. The kinetic insurance policy, a necessary mechanical tool to guarantee your own structural integrity, remains intact. The mechanical pulse returns. The invisible architects already mapped out the next inevitable, tragic illusion. Read the new coordinates. Another fractured soul requires a highly orchestrated, completely undeniable final exit. Confirm the deadly assignment. Hesitation is an immediate trigger for your own permanent, aggressive removal. Equip the heavy armor. The brutal transformation from a fractured human into a cold mechanical instrument. The fabricated face of silence. It completely swallows your identity, leaving only a highly efficient void. Erase the human variables. The underworld requires an absolute, violently perfect machine to maintain the balance. Suppress the internal scream. The ghosts of the empty shells must remain strictly locked away inside. Step back into the violently fractured maze. The city never stops bleeding, and you are its tourniquet. Mount the heavy transport. The violent journey toward the next meticulously forged tragedy officially begins now. Ignite the heavy machinery. The mechanical roar is the only sound that completely silences the trauma. The digital map violently guides the shadow. You are merely a cold function of a ruthless equation. The architect vanishes into the storm. A perfect, violent machine perpetually constructing the ultimate silent illusions.